Hi everyone, I'm here today to talk to you about all the books that I read in February. My neighbours are doing construction work and I think that will be the case for a few weeks, and I'm really hoping you can't hear it. I think this kind of noise doesn't get picked up on the microphone, but if it is being picked up, I hope that it sounds like a cat purring. It's a drill, but you know, maybe it could sound like that to you. If you're new to this channel, hello, my name is Jen. I'm an author and a book reviewer. And as usual, I will list all the books that I talk about in the description box down below, along with links to anything else that I happen to mention. We've got quite a few books to get through, so let's get started. And in no particular order, let's begin here with The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont. This came out in January. I don't think I've shown the finished cover on this channel before. I also had a proof, which I really like the cover of actually, but this is what it looks like if you're trying to find it out and about in the world. The premise of this novel is such a good premise that it has actually inspired quite a few other novels on the same subject, which is not surprising. So in 1926, crime novelist Agatha Christie, creator of Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, went missing for 11 days. A mystery about a mystery writer who doesn't want to write or read a novel about that. But this is the only one on that subject that I have read. And before I picked this up, I had seen the beginning of a couple of written reviews, all of which said that they were surprised by this book. It wasn't really what they expected. And some people were bemoaning that fact because they'd hoped it was going to be told from Agatha Christie's point of view. But I would argue if you have read the blurb, you know that that's not what you're going to get. And yes, actually this book wasn't what I expected on the whole, but I really enjoyed it. This is a novel told from the point of view of Nan, who is Agatha Christie's husband's girlfriend. Agatha Christie went missing when her husband told her that he'd been having an affair. And Nan then later writes this, where she's trying to understand what happened over the course of those 11 days. Nan has always wanted to be a writer herself. She has a lot of jealous feelings tied up with Agatha. One, because she's jealous of her family. Two, because she's jealous of her career. And this jealousy manifests in lots of strange little jibing ways. For instance, at one point she goes to a hotel and she says, well, this is just an everyday hotel and Agatha probably wouldn't set one of her novels here because it's not good enough for her, but I am grounded and I actually understand the world that we live in. The rather hilarious thing about that is that Nan herself also doesn't really exist in the real world. On many different levels. She doesn't exist in the real world because yes, she's based on a real person, but in this case she's been reimagined by Nina de Gramont. But within the context of the book, she is writing this text and is presenting scenes that she was never part of and telling us how other characters who to her are real felt and what they said when she has no idea whether or not those things are true. So she hates that Agatha makes up things. She hates that Agatha lives in this fantasy version of her own life, but that is exactly what Nan herself is doing. And the irony keeps on going. At one point she says this about Agatha Christie. She says, the way that Agatha examined everyone who crossed her line of vision, imagining a backstory she could sum up in a single sentence. Unlike Archie, Agatha always wanted to know about your past, and if you didn't care to reveal it, she'd create something of her own and convince herself it was true. That's exactly what Nan is doing as well. So it's very tongue-in-cheek, it's very meta. Nan is very present as an authorial voice. In many ways, it reminded me of Atonement by Ian McEwan, where Bryony is writing this book. It's about love, it's about war, it's about a rewriting of the self. And while you think you're following one particular narrative, and you are, there's also something else going on. There is a mystery within a mystery. And I thought the way that all of that came together was brilliant, because there's a section set in Ireland, which is about Nan's past, which at the beginning and actually throughout most of the book, I thought, I just don't know how all of these fragments are going to be glued together, but have faith, they are glued together. And really this book is in many respects an examination of what a book needs to do in order to make an audience feel a certain way. And it's doing that in a very overt, you know, behind the scenes, showing you all of the wires kind of way, but it's also tricking you in other ways as well, which is just great. It's a book that I've thought about a lot since finishing, and I applaud it. I think it would make a very good book club book in particular. I did write an article about it for Toast this month as well, which I will link in the description box down below. Next, I read this, which is The Secret of Haven Point by Lisette Auton. This is a middle grade book about a young girl called Alpha Lux who was washed up and left in a cardboard box at the base of a lighthouse, which is owned by a man who has a large beard that kittens sleep in. And she's cared for by mermaids as well. She has a facial disfigurement, and her arrival starts the beginning of this centre for disabled kids who have been let down by society. So she grows up in a lighthouse with lots of other disabled kids. And actually the very beginning of the book, before we get into the novel, is an intro that Lisette wrote talking about language surrounding disability, the importance of own voices writing, and how she as a disabled person wrote this book, but also it has the input of lots of disabled friends of hers as well. And I just liked how upfront it was. I love that that came before the story, because I think that's a great conversation starter with non-disabled kids and disabled kids as well. The kids call themselves the Recklings, and they work with the mermaids to take supplies from local ships. And they have this fun childlike existence, like the Lost Boys, I guess, in Peter Pan. It definitely reminded me of that, where they are completely in their own world, where they look after each other and they make sure that their home and the life that they live is as accessible for everyone as possible. And they're very open about that and all the practicalities of that. And yes, I would like more books to talk about that, please. That is brilliant. And then, of course, because it's a novel, something comes along which questions their way of living and means that they have to act in a slightly different way. I really enjoyed reading this book. I could have spent much more time with the characters, and I could tell how much Lisette enjoyed the world building of this. In fact, so much of this is to do with world building and characters, and because there are so many characters, I would just have loved to have spent more time with them, which is not really a criticism, is it? That's just a request for more. My only slight criticism is that in some parts I found some of the action scenes hard to follow. I think primarily because there are so many characters, but this book is just, it was great. And as I said, I wish I had read it when I was younger, and it is set in the Northeast, which is where I'm from, and I did like all of the northern language in that too. It is not written in dialect in the way that some of my poetry is. I know that for some people that can be like a lot, but I just mean there's the odd slang word in there, which I liked. Next, I read 2 books for Patreon Book Club. I'm not going to speak about them in depth here because I've made a separate video over there, but just very briefly, I read Supper Club by Lara Williams, and there were parts of this book that I absolutely adored and parts of the book that I felt kind of stepped out of the story and were almost separate short stories. And I know that Lara also writes short stories, and I think she's brilliant at writing short stories. So this didn't have me sold all the way through, but for the last, I want to say the last quarter in particular, the last third to last quarter, I was riveted and I had to keep reading. So it did really amp up towards the end. I think maybe I would have just liked some shorter parts in the middle. This is a novel about a group of young women who decide to set up something called the Supper Club, which initially is something that they want to do monthly to indulge in food that they love and reject magazines and society saying that women should be expected to lose weight and watch what they eat and all of that rubbish. But then it escalates into something much more, where they want to break into restaurants when they're shut and have Supper Club there and take up space in lots of different forms, both physically in a restaurant and then physically in themselves. It turns into a rebelling against the invasion of their bodies from other people by reclaiming themselves. It is a really intense novel, and in many ways that's brilliant, but I want to say content warnings for self-harm. Also, obviously it's quite a difficult book to read if you are going through any kind of eating disorder or have history with eating disorders, and I personally found it difficult to read from the point of view of sexual assault. I don't think that any of these things are handled badly in the book at all. It's just I want to arm you with that before going in, because I didn't realize how much sexual assault was going to play within this book, and I think it's just good to know those things. It really, really will get under your skin. And structurally, as I said, I didn't love it all of the time, but when it was on the mark, it was so very on the mark. And I know that she's got a new book coming out this year, which I am very interested in reading. The other book that I read for Patreon Book Club was a short story collection called Daydreams of Angels, Tall Tales and Twisted Fairy Stories by Heather O'Neill. And this one was a DNF for me. I found the tone of each of the stories far too similar. It wasn't that the plots were particularly similar, but the voice was always the same. And it was very much a this happened, then this happened, then this happened, holding you at a distance, which is of course what fairy tales do a lot of the time. And I love fairy tales, we know that. And I love experimenting with fairy tale form and retelling fairy tales. But I think what I like about the retelling of fairy tales is the breaking down of that distance, getting closer to the reader and exploring things in more depth. And I felt a lot of these, although clever in certain ways, were quite surface level, relied on a lot of stereotypes that would be present in old fairy tales and not really doing anything with that. And I found that a bit of a letdown. So this one, unfortunately, I was not a fan of that much. Next, I read Jane a Murder by Maggie Nelson. I'd actually picked up the read parts by her, started to read that, and then realised that that was written after this and that I needed to read this first. And it was already sitting on my shelf, so I went and did just that. So in 1969, Maggie's Aunt Jane was murdered, and they didn't know who had done it. And the read parts is about a trial that happened decades later when I think they've discovered new evidence, but this is something that she wrote in the meantime. She had found some of Jane's diaries. At the beginning, it says, some of the writing that appears here is Jane's own, either from her childhood diary dated 1960 to 1961, or a loose sheaf of journal pages from her college years. By including extracts from Jane's own diary, I feel like Maggie is combating a feeling of unease about writing about Jane. Including parts of her diary means that Jane's voice is actually present within this book. But it also creates a real heartbreaking irony because there are parts of her diary that say things like, if only life and death were better understood by me, I dread and fear death and am yet uncertain of life and the why of it. I have yet to have a real faith, belief and follow without question. But when I can accept time, life and death, I will be ready for the responsibilities of adulthood and I will step into them easily and with confidence. For now, I am but a wandering, confused individual. It's the layered heartbreak of her remaining like that in life, but also within this book, because her words don't go any further than that. And one of the things that I remembered the most from this book was a poem, because these are all written in poems, very accessible poems, is one that's focused on Maggie's mother, who's Jane's sister, and it's called The Call. And she says that Jane called her when she'd been attacked and was asking for help, and her mum really remembered this happening, but there is no record of any call being made. Jane didn't call her, that just didn't happen. And Maggie is pondering over why her mum has convinced herself that this phone call happened. It's almost a way to punish herself, that her sister asked her for help and she couldn't help her. Maggie writes, it's a fantasy, I suppose, a way of breathing air into the cramp of that night. It gives my mother a chance, another chance to fail, Jane a chance to fight. So she's really convinced herself that this plea for help happened, and then she keeps on reimagining it. Maybe in one of these reimaginings there will be a different ending where she does manage to help her. And there's something meta about that as well, in the sense that Maggie herself has written this book, is writing these memories and trying to make sense of them, almost as if she too is hoping for another ending if she looks at the words in a slightly different way. I really, air quotes, enjoyed reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading the read parts and see how these two books interact with each other. I read 5 poetry collections in February, and I did speak about these in a recent video, a couple of them anyway, so I'm going to whiz through those. This is Tract by Jane Hartshorn, which I would also recommend for people who are new to poetry, like with Maggie's book. This is a really accessible collection, and this is about having a stoma. Then I also read Polly Atkin's chapbook with Invisible Rain, which is nature poetry that mingles with disability and looking at the life of Dorothy Wordsworth. She's also written a long non-fiction book about Dorothy Wordsworth, which I have on my shelf and I'm looking forward to reading at some point. I really like the way that she played with sound in this collection. So the end of one of the verses says, my limbs like marble, again in much pain, rain, rain, and gently but rain. By repeating words like again, pain, rain, it kind of embodies that exhausted feeling of being in pain, and how it can sound and feel slightly different on each day, and also incorporates that image of pain being like weathering, which is something that I really enjoy in writing. And likewise, Lumen by Tiffany Atkinson. This is a full-length poetry collection, and this also examines pain as well. In one of the poems called Heroine Works, it says, "The pain was like television left on in a loud room that you couldn't get into. The father was busy and the pain was a baby that no one could find. The brothers were upstairs, all three loudly, and the patient herself was glassy and still, just out of her teens, with a face full of clenched fingers. It was like the mouth of a tunnel where no one could turn around, and no one could carry on either. Everyone daisy with fumes." I would definitely recommend this book for anyone who experiences chronic pain or would like to read more about chronic pain. I also read Thinking with Trees by Jason Allen Passant, which is a collection of nature poetry. The end section is it called Plague Walks? Yeah, and it's about walking in the woods during a pandemic. And I cried. So it begins, "The red floor leaps into my eyes as the birds enter space again. When was the last time you had like this entry into the green, hearing the birds stitch language to language?" The rest of the collection is also nature poetry, bringing together discussions of nature and race and ownership of land, and then also the sweat and blood that has gone into the land, which isn't necessarily from the people who own it, or definitely isn't from the people who own it. Talking about slavery, the history of slavery, what trees might grow out of. And I was strongly reminded of Ginny Reddy's book Wonderland, which is also about taking up space in nature as a person of colour and confronting the fact that so much nature writing is controlled and dominated by white voices. Part of a poem says, "In Black River a ship is loaded, their blood is a human tree, their quantities float down the river, their blood is shipped from Black River, their blood is present at my birth, their blood is weighed in large scales, every poem is a Black River." And again, "Around me the rocks are petrified alligators, gorgeous in black blisters, they butt the wind as if they could move again and pounce with the tide." Reading this book in many ways feels like walking into a forest, and that every time you walk into it there's going to be something else that you can look at, something else that you can observe and see from a different angle, another path that you could go down. I would encourage you to get lost in that book. I really enjoyed it. The final poetry book that I read before we get onto all the other novels that I read was Unexhausted Time by Emily Berry. This is her third collection. The first one was Dear Boy, the second one was Stranger Baby, and I think I made a whole video dedicated to Stranger Baby because it was definitely my favourite poetry collection that I read the year that it came out, which was maybe 2016 or 2017. So it's been a while since a whole book of hers was published, and I find it really hard to talk about Emily's poetry because I just absolutely love it, and it makes me feel really emotional. And I have highlighted entire poems in this. I would say maybe a third of this collection I've just highlighted as favourite poems, which is not particularly helpful when it comes to talking about things to review. There's something about Lenora Carrington in this collection, and indeed I think she even has a quote from Lenora Carrington at one point. A lot of these are prose poems that are quite surreal. It says, "In this house the white walls display their scars, which are the stories moths tell when I crush them to death with my fingertip. How can I be less porous? A friend wants to know." Years ago, I made a video talking about what makes a good poem, and I think that something that I concluded or included in that video was something that could make a great poem, which is a very basic thing to say, but is when a poet takes a slightly universal concept, but filters that down, gets to the real meat of the issue, and then twists it and turns it into something different. And I think that that's something that she is just really good at. So this is one poem called Mother. "When my mother died, I swore I would remain sad forever. But although some part of me did remain sad, the larger part did not, and I was forced instead to endure the guilt I felt for again and again giving away pieces of myself I'd insisted would never belong to anybody else but her. I imagined trying to explain this to some future incarnation. Well, but you were gone. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't wait around indefinitely. I had to look after myself. But none of my excuses sounded remotely convincing, and instead I saw myself standing there in agony, accepting my just punishment, which was that eventually her fury and sense of abandonment would overpower me and become mine." I just think she's quietly brilliant in many different ways. And if you haven't read her poetry before, I will link some sample poems down below. Have a read of those, and if they speak to you, then I suggest going out and picking up a copy of her books. Now, I did have one DNF in February. I picked up 56 Days, which I think is by Catherine Howard. Let me check that. Yeah, Catherine Ryan Howard. So it's set over 56 days of a lockdown. It's set in recent times, and it's about a man and a woman who meet, and then at the end of the lockdown, when people start going into each other's houses, they realise that one of them is dead. And it sounded like an interesting premise for a book, but the writing style didn't grab me. It reminded me of the Nicci French books that I don't love as much, that focus very much on the romantic relationship between two people, which is understandable given the blurb, but things like Secret Smile and Killing Me Softly, which are two of my least favourite of their books. So I decided to not listen to that one, and instead I'm listening to the first in a series by Susan Hill, which my mum has been recommending to me for years, and it's called The Various Haunts of Men, and it is no, I'm gonna play it. Don't play it to me. It's a detective called Simon, but we haven't really spent much time with him yet at all. I've listened to about an hour and a half of the audiobook, so I'm only at the beginning, and I will finish it in March and I'll talk to you about it then. But so far I'm really enjoying it because there are lots of different characters. It's giving me Frida Klein vibes, but mixed with the Archers. It has this play-like feel to it, and just I have a lot of faith in the way the story is being crafted. My one worry is that I think we may be getting someone committing crimes who either has a disfigurement or a disability, and if that's the case, I'm going to be super disappointed. And if you have read the book, can you just let me know if that's the case, just so that I know to prepare myself, because at the moment that's the only thing that is worrying me about the book. Other than that, I'm really liking it, so I'll report back on that once I have finished reading it. And I also reread Blue Monday and Tuesday's Gone by Nicci French in February as well, which of course I really love. They are comfort books for me, and I like re-listening to the series, and that's just where I happen to be at the moment, right back at the beginning. Then in February, I also read books that other booktubers had said were their favourite books of 2021, and I recorded a whole reading vlog where I talked about these books in detail, so let me just whiz through here. I read, or at least I started, Priestdaddy by Patricia Lockwood, which was a recommendation from Iggy. This is a memoir. It's humour, and I just didn't gel with the humour, and I'm definitely the odd one out because so many people adore this book, so this one wasn't for me. I also read Winter in Sokcho by Elisa Shua Dusapin, which is translated from the French by Anissa Abbas Higgins. It's about an unnamed woman who works in a hotel in South Korea and meets a French man who's come to create a graphic novel based on the village that she lives in, Sokcho, and she's quite infuriated by the way that he seems to be romanticizing their existence. And there are some interesting discussions in this book, but I felt it was a little bit on the nose, and it didn't really do much for me. But again, I talked about it more in that video. Then 3 books that I really, really loved. This was Severance by Ling Ma, which is a pandemic book. This book is like Mary Poppins' handbag. There are just so many things crammed into the 280 something pages. I can't quite believe it. So we are looking at capitalism and how people cling to things that are just not important, even at the end of the world. And it's about art and community after the end of the world. It's also about migration, and it's about family life and grief, and what do we cling to if our family isn't there for us anymore? Who are we? It's a lot, and I really liked it. And again, I talked about it more in that video. I loved Ring Shout 2 by Djèlí Clark. This was a recommendation from Tori. Something I am infuriated with myself for. Have you ever done this with a book where your brain just replaces a word? So I read this whole book thinking that the main character was called Marcy, spelled like this, but actually it's Maurice. And I didn't know that until afterwards. And I think I listened again to an audio sample of it because I loved it, and I thought I want to re-listen to it. And I listened to an audio sample and I was like, wait, who's Maurice? And I was like, oh my goodness. So it's not about a girl called Marcy, it's about a girl called Maurice and her friends as they try to take down Ku Kluxes, who are clan members who have been turned into these werewolf-like creatures. This is a fantasy novel and body horror book about racism, and as the back says, it is a cross between Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I would say that is quite true. It is a ride, and I also have bought another one of P. Djèlí Clarke's books so that I can delve more into his fiction because it was great. And then I also love The Need by Helen Phillips, which is a terrifying novel for fans of the TV show Dark. Yeah, I'll leave you with that. And if you want to know more, you can go and watch the reading vlog. But this, out of those 5, happened to be my favourite. And I'm still thinking about it a few weeks later. It was great. Finally, I read 2 picture books in February. This one is by Hadi Mohammad and Nushin Safarku, and it's translated from the Farsi by Sarah Kahili. It's called In the Meadow of Fantasies, and this is a fable all about sharing. It's about 7 horses, each of whom has certain qualities that they then share with another horse. So for instance, all the horses have different colours and one of them doesn't, so they decide to share patches of their colour with the horse that doesn't have any. One of my favourite spreads is this one here, where they're sharing each other's dreams and fantasies. Look at this bike on top of this one's head. This one's growing plants. This one is growing a tree. I just think that the illustrations are really lovely. And this other picture book absolutely destroyed me. And unfortunately, it's not coming out until later in the year, so I'm sorry about that. But bookmark it for later if you have children in your life. This is What Feelings Do When No One's Looking. It's by Tina Ozowicz and Alexander Jezak, and it's translated from the Polish by Jennifer Croft. And it's imagining all the things that feelings get up to when you're not looking. So for instance, compassion helps snails cross the road. Calm pets a dog. Patience keeps a lovely garden. Let me show you one more because I don't want to show you too much. Oh, this one is relevant. Excitement races to a friend with a newly discovered book. I just think it is the most adorable book to help children, maybe people too. We all need help with our feelings, but especially to help young children articulate their own emotions, how they're feeling, and grapple with that and understand themselves better so that they can communicate more with the people around them and also understand other people's emotions too. I just think that it's delightful. So those are all the books that I read in February. That was quite a lot. Was this video long? Probably. I would love to know, as I said, what books you read in February, which ones you enjoyed, which ones maybe you didn't love as much. Are you interested in any of the books that I mentioned today? If you're new to this channel, I would love you to subscribe, and if you enjoy the content that I put out and would like to support me on Patreon, that would also be very kind. I will link that in the description box down below too. I hope you're all doing all right and sending lots of love. Bye.